Everyone, we're going to go over chapter 3, which is going to talk about philosophy and theory inside of social work research. So, the phases of the research process. This actually mirrors the process that you will go through as part of your studies here at Radford. Right now, we are obviously at stage 1. You guys are trying to figure out what topic you are interested in. What problem are you trying to address? The end of stage 1 comes with a research question, something that you can actually use social science to try and investigate. You then design a study that is trying to answer that research question, collect some data, process and then analyze that data, interpret the findings, and then disseminate those results. That last step is going to be a poster session during the last summer of your studies here that is going to address the faculty members about the study that you actually conducted. Some important things to note in this process is that in qualitative research, it's a little bit more flexible and a little bit more open. Where you start out with your qualitative research may not be where you end up. Whereas in quantitative research, you really do have to follow the specific steps. In qualitative research, you can go back and sort of revise after, for example, you go to your clients and you originally started off with this idea of what you thought you might find and what is important to them. Your clients might tell you something completely different. Participants in your study might actually say that this other concept, which you hadn't even considered, is the most important part of it. So you might actually end up tweaking the design of your study to accommodate what your participants are saying. Other important things to note is that dissemination doesn't necessarily have to be through scholarly media. It can be through publications in journals, presentations at conferences, which is what we're simulating with that poster session. But it could also mean publication in online forums, through mass media, through a whole host of different ways. Let's go over some basic terms in Chapter 3. So ideology is basically your worldview. It's a little bit of a closed system. You're not really open to revising that stuff. Now, as a person, I know that I have tried out a number of different ideologies as I've developed. And I have actually changed some of those things. But the ideology that I have right now is the thing that I assume pretty much to be the truth. And we all have ideologies and we all have things that we might be ideologues about, some things that we're pretty convinced are true, and just sort of things about how we understand the world. Now, a less stringent sort of framework or worldview is called a paradigm. So paradigms are things like post-positivism, empowerment, interpretivism, constructivism, feminism. Those paradigms, they help guide your understanding. It's a sort of general intellectual stance. They answer philosophical questions about the world and about how we understand things inside of that world. It's less rigid than ideology, but it's also not as formal as theory. Theory is a systematic set of interrelated statements that's trying to explain something. It usually has to do with what is, not necessarily what should be in the real world. And a step down from that is practice models. So there are views of social work practice, things like the strengths-based model. It's guided by theory, it's guided by ideas from humanistic theory, but it's not really a theory itself. It's more about what we do inside of the practice world. So let's go over the components of a theory. And we're going to use the U-shaped curve of marital happiness as our example. So my hypothesis might be that time and marital happiness are related to each other. So time and marital happiness are my variables. They're the things that change. So time changes, obviously, as we move forward in time. Marital happiness also changes from day to day and over time during a relationship. Now, the relationship between time and marital happiness, you might say, well, the longer that you're with somebody, the more happy you're going to be. That's a positive relationship. As time increases, the marital happiness increases. If you're more pessimistic, you might say that as time increases, marital happiness decreases. That would be a negative relationship. But what's actually found inside the literature is what's called a curvilinear relationship. So marital happiness usually starts off pretty high, then dips once you have kids because those things are very stressful. And then after kids tend to leave the home, then marital happiness actually goes right back up and you get towards what's called a second honeymoon. So the independent variable here, or the cause, is time. So the only thing that's causing changes in marital happiness inside of this model is the amount of time that this couple has been married. The dependent variable then is marital happiness. A way of stating this is marital happiness changes based on changes in time. The dependent variable, marital happiness, depends on changes in time. So marital happiness is also a good example of a concept. It's just an idea. That idea then has attributes, things like very happy, not so happy, not happy at all, very dissatisfied, that sort of stuff. You might make observations of somebody's happiness. You might bring people into a lab and observe how they interact with each other. You might give them a survey. You might interview them. All of those things would be empirical observations of marital happiness. In thinking about theories, it's important to understand two causal models. So the idiographic model is best summarized as what is true for me, or what is true for one individual person. Idiographic causal models try to understand a particular case, and instead of whittling down that case to maybe one or two or three key factors, it tries to understand all of the things that went into that particular case. So a good example is, why has a particular person been able to overcome all of these barriers to rise to the top of their profession? And that is most appropriately investigated with qualitative methods. Qualitative methods are going to give you all of that information that you want, all of those different factors that are filtered through that person's experience. The nomothetic models, nomothetic causal models, are trying to figure out what's true for everybody. So it's trying to figure out maybe what three factors generally predict a person rising to the top of their profession. So that's a partial explanation, and it's an incomplete understanding using just a few factors, but you do get a general law. You can then take this stuff and apply it to everybody. By taking inside of an idiographic model, you're really just trying to understand what happened with this person in this particular time in this particular place. You're trying to understand. In nomothetic causal explanations, you're trying to predict. You're trying to say, okay, what happened with all of these people? And then what sort of general laws can we apply to everybody inside of society based on what we found in our sample? And this is more consonant with quantitative methods. Some other important terms are inductive and deductive reasoning. So let's start with deductive reasoning. If we take things like deductive reasoning starts with theory. So let's take a thing like unconditional positive regard, which is a concept from humanistic theory. So I might say that regardless of intervention, that unconditional positive regard, the more of unconditional positive regard there is, the better my patient's outcomes are going to be. That is a hypothesis. It's based in humanistic theory. I would then test that hypothesis using some science. I would gather a sample of people who are currently in treatment, measure their unconditional positive regard, and then see whether or not I was right. Is my hypothesis correct that unconditional positive regard leads to these better outcomes regardless of any other interventions that are done, or do the interventions actually matter? Inductive reasoning is more about building theory. It's about making sense of a whole host of different observations and trying to make generalizations. So if we think about, how did Carl Rogers come up with this idea of unconditional positive regard? Well, I'm pretty sure that he did it based on his practice experience. He saw a lot of different clients and tried to figure out what was actually going on, what was leading to these improvements in his clients. And that is how he came up with the idea of unconditional positive regard. So you can see these things are connected with each other, though. So inductive reasoning will take observations, try and come up with some generalizations, and then deductive reasoning will take the theories that come out of that and then test them using hypotheses and observations. So this is a wheel that keeps going around and around. Generally speaking, inductive reasoning is most associated with qualitative research, deductive reasoning most associated with quantitative research, but that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. It's important to note that knowledge is probabilistic, that we don't generally say that we proved things. We might say that things indicate certain other things, that a change here is associated with a change here. And part of being a social worker is being uncomfortable with uncertainty, and that extends into the social scientific parts of being a social worker. So let's talk a little bit about philosophy of science. Um, Philosophy of science and paradigms try to answer a couple of different questions. What is real? What's true? How do you know what's true? And what methodology do you use to find truth? And is the world changing or is it static? So paradigms in social work research are sort of meta-theoretical. They are sort of, if you can think of them as corrals in which theories might exist. So contemporary positivism emphasizes objectivity, precisely measuring things, and generalizability. Generalizability meaning taking what you find inside of a sample in a social science study and generalizing it to an overall population of people. Interpretivism is the more touchy-feely side of social science. So it's focusing on in-depth explanation, those idiographic causal explanations, and how people just understand their own lives. So focusing on subjectivity rather than objectivity. The empowerment paradigm focuses on oppression and tries to use research methods to empower oppressed groups, to try and liberate them from oppressive forces inside of society, as well as oppressive forces inside of their own head. So let's walk through these and what the different paradigms, how they might understand a concept like grief. Postpositivism would say, well, there's not one true definition of grief. Positivism from the early part of the 20th century, that grief definitely exists just like a table exists. But postpositivists would say, okay, there's not one true definition of grief, but we scientists have a pretty good idea of what grief means, and we are pretty sure that it exists. And it has properties that we can observe, and that we can observe those things usually mathematically. And we are going to operationally define our variable grief and then measure the properties using social theory as a guide. Now, positivists will generally say that we have an idea of what grief is, but we know that it varies by culture. We know that we are not perfectly objective observers of society. So we can't necessarily know that our definition of grief is always and forever the true definition itself. Interpretivism would say that grief, everybody has their own definition of what grief is. There is no one true definition. Postpositivists would agree, but what interpretivists are trying to do is understand grief in the terms of people experiencing it, not in the terms of scientists or supposed experts. That the experts, and this is pretty consistent with social work theory, is that the experts are the people who are actually experiencing the issue. More importantly, that grief really only exists in the minds of human beings. Grief doesn't exist like a table exists. It exists only in as much as it is perceived, and in as much as we talk about to each other what grief is. That grief is a social construct, and that it's grounded in the meanings that individuals actually give to the term. And that scientists are trying to understand grief, not necessarily predict like you would inside of the post-positivistic paradigm, but just trying to understand grief in the terms of the people inside of your study. Finally, I'm going to go over some empowerment paradigms. I see that I'm running out of time on my 15-minute clock, so I will see you in part 3.